The man who sold me called me Barren. A traitor to her husband's name, he shouted, loud enough for the others to hear. No use to him, so now she's yours for half. The words were meant to sting, to peel back the last layer of my dignity. But I didn't flinch. I had flinched the first time, when my mother-in-law spit in my hair because the morning sickness never came. I had flinched the second time, when my husband locked the pantry door from the outside and didn't return for 2 days, leaving me with nothing but darkness and the gnawing truth of my own worthlessness. But not now. Not when I stood barefoot on a splintered trading block, a torn shawl my only shield against the judging eyes. My own eyes refused to cry anymore. They were just 2 dry wells in a parched land. The man who bought me was a surprise. The others had poked and prodded, their gazes crawling over me like flies, asking about my hips, my teeth, my womb. This man didn't look at my body at all. His gaze was fixed somewhere over my shoulder on the distant, shimmering horizon. He was tall, his skin the color of rich earth, his hair a long black river down his back. Apache. The name itself was a ghost story told around campfires back home. He didn't haggle, he didn't speak. He simply nodded once, a gesture so small it was almost lost in the dusty air, and handed my former brother-in-law a rusted hunting knife. The blade was chipped, the handle worn, smooth. It was an insult of a payment. It was perfect. Without a word, he gestured toward a lean, spotted horse tied to a post behind him. I slid off the block, my feet silent on the hard-packed dirt, and climbed onto the horse's back without waiting for help. I didn't ask where we were going. It didn't matter. Anywhere was nowhere, and nowhere was already so much better than where I had been. He didn't speak for the first day, or the second. He rode ahead, a silent guide through a labyrinth of mesquite and chala cactus. The world was a canvas of brown and pale green, stretching into an endless, aching sky. We stopped only to rest his horse, or when he would silently pass me a strip of dried, salted meat. It was tough and tasted of smoke and survival. His eyes, when I caught a glimpse of them, were dark, sharp, and unnervingly still. They were not the eyes of the fire-breathing devils from the whispered tales. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the end of the world and had simply kept walking. There was a profound emptiness in him, a quiet that mirrored my own. We were 2 ghosts riding through a haunted land. On the morning of the 3rd day, as we crossed a dry arroyo, the cracked earth like shattered pottery, he pulled his horse to a sudden halt. His gaze was fixed on something half buried in the sand. I followed his line of sight and saw it. A single child's sandal made of worn leather, with a single blue bead still clinging to its strap. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, as if the air itself was heavy. He knelt and picked it up, cradling it in his palm. He stared at it for a long, long time, his face a mask of stone. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind whistling through the scrub brush. I thought he might bury it, or leave it, or throw it away. Instead, without warning, he turned his head and looked directly at me. It was the first time our eyes had truly met. And then he spoke. "Can you cook with yucca?" he asked. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a sound scraped from the very bottom of that well of silence. It was the first word he'd spoken to me in 3 days. Just 4 words that landed in the quiet between us like a spark. Yucca, a bitter, stringy root, a food of last resort. My own voice felt foreign in my throat, thin and brittle from disuse. "Yes," I answered. He just nodded, a slight dip of his chin, and tucked the child's sandal carefully into a pouch on his belt. Then he turned and kept walking, leading the horses forward, as if the question had answered something far more important than what we would have for supper. That small, discarded sandal was a clue, but I had no idea what mystery it was meant to solve. That night, the air grew teeth. A cold wind swept down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and secrets. He didn't build a large fire, just a small, contained pit of coals that glowed like a single angry eye in the oppressive darkness. He pulled a yucca root from his saddlebag, its rough skin coated in dust. He showed me how to strip the fibrous bark from the agave stalks he'd gathered, his hands moving with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. There was no wasted energy in this man. Every gesture had a purpose. I, in turn, showed him how to boil the starchy interior with a handful of bitter herbs I recognized from the riverbank, a trick an old woman had taught me once to leach out the harshness. We worked in silence, a strange, unspoken partnership. No one said what we were building there, in the flickering firelight between us. It wasn't kindness. It certainly wasn't rescue. It felt more like the sound of two people quietly acknowledging they were no longer pretending they weren't broken. We were two fractured halves of a whole I couldn't yet comprehend. At dawn, I woke with a start, the cold having seeped deep into my bones. Beside my thin blanket was a small, neatly folded bundle of deer hide. I hesitated, my hand hovering over it. Gifts, in my experience, always came with a price tag attached. But my curiosity won. I unfolded the hide. Inside were two shriveled dried apples, a treasure in this barren land. Beside them, a pair of soft-soled moccasins, stitched with sinew, perfectly my size. And nestled between them was a single magnificent eagle feather, its edges tipped in white, so perfect it didn't look real. I touched the feather lightly, its barbs soft against my calloused fingertip. I didn't understand its meaning, not at all, but I knew with a bone-deep certainty it wasn't a gift meant to be returned. It was a statement, a declaration. But of what? The warrior still hadn't told me his name. He hadn't told me where we were going. But somehow, with this small, silent offering, he had already given me something no other man ever had. He had given me a beginning. We reached the village on the 5th day. It wasn't a place you could stumble upon by accident. It was tucked deep inside a hidden canyon, a secret held in the earth's palm. The cliffs rose on either side, their faces burning a fierce metallic copper beneath the afternoon sun. It was beautiful and terrifying all at once. There were no songs of welcome, no drums beat a rhythm to announce our arrival. This was not that kind of place. The quiet here was different from the quiet of the wilderness. It was a heavy, watchful silence. Children with wide, dark eyes peeked from the doorways of low, earth-covered lodges, blinking like little owls before vanishing back into the shadows. Elders paused their weaving, their gnarled fingers stilling on the loom, but they said nothing. Their faces were carved with a grief so profound it seemed a part of the landscape itself. The Apache warrior, still a man without a name, led me past them all, his back straight, his gaze fixed forward. He seemed oblivious to the stairs, or perhaps he was just used to them. He led me to a small lodge set slightly apart from the others, near a bend in the shallow, whispering river. He stopped at the entrance, a simple flap of hide, and gestured for me to enter. I did, without question. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and cedar smoke. It was sparse. A pile of soft furs lay in one corner, a circular cooking pit in the center, and 3 smooth gray river stones laid side by side in the cold ashes. It was empty, yet it felt expectant. "Yours now," he said simply. The words hung in the air, plain and absolute. And then he turned and left. Just like that. I was alone in a strange new home I hadn't asked for, in a village of silent people, bought by a man who wouldn't even share his own lodge with me. That night, he didn't sleep there. He didn't come back at all. I didn't ask why. I didn't know who to ask. I just wrapped myself in the furs, staring at the 3 stones in the fire pit, wondering what they signified. They felt deliberate, symbolic. But of what? Was I a prisoner, a servant, or something else entirely? The silence of the canyon was my only answer. In the morning, just as the sun began to paint the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, he returned. He wasn't alone. He was leading a small, bleeding goat on a rope of braided leather. He tethered it to a post just outside my new home. "You'll need milk," he said, his voice as flat and unreadable as ever. "The baby girl prefers it warm." I blinked. My mind snagged on his words. What baby girl? But before the question could even form on my lips, he was gone again, melting back into the trees as silently as he had appeared. A goat, warm milk, a baby girl. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture I didn't understand and wasn't sure I wanted to. Was I to be a wet nurse? A nanny? My mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The man had bought a barren woman to care for a child. It made no sense. As dusk began to settle, casting long, creeping shadows across the canyon floor, I heard the soft scuff of feet on the dirt outside. I looked up from the small fire I'd managed to coax to life. Two tiny boys, no older than 5 or 6, stood in the doorway. They were mirror images of each other, with the same wide, solemn eyes and ragged-cut black hair. They just stood there, staring at me, their silence as heavy and profound as the man who brought me here. Finally, the older of the two, summoning some hidden reserve of courage, spoke. His voice was a tiny whisper. "He said you know stories." I looked at their faces, so serious, so old for their years. I saw the same hollowed-out look I recognized from my own reflection. I nodded slowly, a lump forming in my throat. "I do," I managed to say. They took that as an invitation. They came inside and sat beside me by the fire, wordless, like people who had forgotten how to hope for anything good. They didn't ask for food. They didn't ask for warmth. They just wanted a story. I didn't know their names. I didn't know if they belonged to the silent warrior. But later that night, as I laid the youngest to sleep beside my own blanket, his small hand clutching a fold of my skirt, I looked at the fire pit again, and I finally understood. The 3 stones. They hadn't been random at all. One for each of them. The 2 boys, and the baby girl who was yet to come. The goat wasn't just a gift, it was a preparation. The empty lodge wasn't a punishment, it was a sanctuary. The man had not brought me here to be a wife. He hadn't brought me here for my womb, the very thing my old life had judged and condemned me for. He had brought me here for my endurance. My hands shook as I boiled water and peeled the yucca roots for a thin stew. No one had ever left children in my care before. They had left me prayers or blame or scorn or silence. But never, ever trust. This felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried, and more terrifying. The baby girl arrived at sunrise, just as he said she would. She was strapped in a cradle board to his back, a tiny, silent bundle wrapped in soft rabbit pelts. He walked into the lodge, his presence filling the small space, and the 2 boys, who had been sleeping, sat up immediately, their eyes wide. "She lost her mother 2 nights ago," he said, his voice low. There was no emotion in it, just a statement of fact, like reporting the weather. He unstrapped the cradle board and gently, so gently, placed the baby into my arms. She doesn't sleep unless she's held. The baby was impossibly small, her face wrinkled and red, her tiny mouth working silently. She smelled of wood smoke and milk. As I cradled her against my chest, she nestled in, her body molding against mine as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment her whole short life. Her tiny fingers, impossibly delicate, clutched at the rough fabric of my shawl. And in that moment, something inside me, a place I thought was long dead and buried under years of shame and disappointment, tightened. It was a phantom limb, a feeling I barely recognized. It was my heart, remembering how to beat. Not a child from my body, but a child in my arms. A life, warm and real and needing. And for the first time since I could remember, I no longer felt barren. I felt full. The woman came at dusk. She didn't knock. The hide flap was simply pushed aside, and she was there, a silhouette against the dying light. She was old, her face a beautiful, tragic map carved by time and grief, her dark eyes holding the wisdom of 1,000 sorrows. She was cloaked in beaded deerskin that shimmered in the firelight. She just stood in the doorway watching me. I was sitting by the fire, bouncing the baby girl on my knee, humming a tune I hadn't known lived in my bones. The 2 boys were already asleep, one curled into my side like a puppy, the other gripping the hem of my skirt as if it were a lifeline anchoring him to the world. "You feed them," the old woman finally said, her voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. She stepped inside, her movements stiff. "But do you know who they are?" I shook my head slowly, my throat tight. I wasn't sure if I should stand or stay seated. Her presence was immense, intimidating. She crouched by the fire, her joints cracking in protest, and stared into the flames, her gaze turned inward. "Their mothers were taken," she said, her voice laced with a bitterness so profound it felt like I could taste it. "All 3 of them. Same raid, same night." She paused, and a single tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. I buried my own daughter with my own hands. My heart seized. The baby in my arms suddenly felt heavier. "They are warriors' children," the old woman continued, her voice hardening. "But warriors fall, and when they fell, the tribe left the children behind, too many mouths to feed, too many reminders of what we lost." I looked down at the 3 sleeping faces, so innocent, so small, abandoned, thrown away, just like me. "And him?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "The silent man, the one who brought me here." "Who is he?" "His name is Toya," the woman answered, finally giving a name to the silence. "It means still river, for the quiet in him runs deep and dangerous." She looked at me then, her eyes sharp, analytical. "He is the brother of one of the fallen mothers, the uncle to the boys. He took in the children no one else would touch. But he cannot raise them alone. He is a hunter, a warrior, not a nurturer." My voice cracked when I asked the question that had been screaming in my mind for days. "Why me?" The old woman let out a short, harsh laugh. It was not a kind sound. "Because you were thrown away like they were," she said, her words brutally direct. "Because you are damaged goods. You won't look at them and see the shame of their birth. You will look at them and see survival." She studied my face in the firelight, and her expression softened, just a fraction. "And because Still River has seen something in you that you do not yet see in yourself." She rose with a grunt of effort, her gaze sweeping over me one last time, as if she were measuring cloth for a shroud. "If you stay," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "the tribe may never call you wife. They may never call you sister. But those children will call you mother. And sometimes that is a title that is heavier and holier than any other." With that, she turned and was gone, leaving me alone with the sleeping children and her echoing words. I sat by the fire long after the sparks died down, the embers glowing like sleeping eyes. I tried to remember the feel of my own mother's hands, but all I could recall were the sharp edges of cold dishes and the colder chill of her disappointed words. I looked down at the baby girl, now suckling sleepily in the crook of my arm. I leaned down and whispered into her wispy hair, a promise that came not from my lips, but from a deep, hollow place beneath my ribs where the ache of emptiness had lived for so long. "No one will leave you again." That place was no longer empty. It was sore, yes, but it was the soreness of new growth cracking through old, dead bark. Outside, the river whispered its secrets to the moon, and I, Sarah, for the first time in more years than I could count, closed my eyes without being afraid of what my dreams might show me. The days that followed began to unfold like the pages of a book someone else had started, one I was now tasked with finishing. The story was familiar, a woman, children, a home, but the language was entirely new to me. The children called me nothing at all at first. They were like feral kittens, wary and watchful, but they communicated in their own silent ways. They simply reached for me when they were scared. They brought me small, smooth stones from the riverbed, or a brightly colored leaf, pressing the offerings into my palm with a solemnity that broke my heart. They made drawings for me in the dirt with a stick, crude depictions of our little lodge with 5 figures standing outside, 3 small, 2 large. I didn't ask for more. This was more than I'd ever had. Then, one afternoon, the older boy, the more serious of the two, pointed at me and said a word. Ima. He said it with such conviction. I didn't know what it meant in the Apache tongue, but I answered to it anyway. The younger boy, his shy little shadow, followed suit a day later, his voice a soft echo. Ima. And the baby, who had no words yet, began a ritual all her own. Whenever she cried or was hungry or just wanted to be held, she would pat my chest with her tiny, open palm, a soft, rhythmic tap, 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 as if she were knocking on a door, reminding herself of where comfort lived. It was the closest I had ever come to belonging anywhere. It was a fragile, tender thing, this little family we were building, a fortress of 5 against a world that had discarded us all. But outside the walls of our small lodge, the silence of the village remained. The other women still avoided my eyes at the river, turning away as if my presence was a bad omen. The men ignored me completely, their gazes sliding past me as if I were a ghost. We were an island. Still River, or Toya, as I now knew to call him, remained a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He brought game, always fresh, always enough. He'd leave it silently by the fire pit, a rabbit, a brace of quail, once even a small deer, and then vanish again into the stone-lined horizon. Sometimes he would sit just long enough to share a meal, eating quickly, his eyes always scanning the canyon walls. He never stayed the night. One evening, after he had gone, I found a folded square of hide placed carefully on the flat stone outside my door. My heart did a little flip. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single, thick braid of my own brown hair, which must have been cut while I slept. It was tied neatly with a strip of sinew, and beside it were 3 small dolls carved from cedar bark. They were crude, but lovingly made. Each doll bore a specific mark, a mark that corresponded to one of the children. The doll for the older boy had a tiny hawk feather tied to its head. The one for the younger had a slash of red ochre painted across its chest, and the baby's doll wore a tiny loop of thread where an earring might be, a perfect replica of the one the child's mother had worn, the one the old woman had described to me. No one needed to claim the gift. No one needed to explain it. It was their way of speaking, a silent message in a language I was beginning to understand. It said, "You are ours now." It was a bond, tied with sinew and carved from wood. That night, for the first time, Toya lingered by the fire long after the children were asleep. The silence between us felt different, less empty, more contemplative. "My sister used to sing by this fire," he said suddenly, his voice soft, his gaze lost in the hypnotic dance of the flames. "Before they came. I knew who they were, the raiders, the reason for this village of sorrow. I didn't ask for details. The wounds were too fresh, too raw. I only said, 'What did she sing?' He was quiet for a long, long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant cry of a night bird. Then, in a voice that was like the wind pressed through bone, low and mournful, he began to hum. It was a melody so slow and sad, it felt like the earth itself was breathing a sigh of grief. It spoke of loss and longing and a pain too deep for words. When he stopped, the silence that fell was heavy with all that had been unsaid. He looked at me, his dark eyes holding a universe of pain, not with want, not with desire, but with something far deeper, a shared understanding. "They called her Barren too," he said quietly. the words dropping into the night like stones into a deep well. Before she adopted the boys, the song. The song was for the children she never had. He stood then, his tall frame unfolding from the ground, and left without another word. But I knew, as I carefully placed the 3 cedar dolls beside my sleeping furs, that the song had shifted. He hadn't just sung it for his sister's memory. He had sung it for me. It no longer mourned only what wasn't. It honored what was just beginning. I saw what Toya's hands could truly do, not with a bow or a blade, but with a simple piece of driftwood. I had taken the older boy, whose name I learned was Kale, to gather herbs along the riverbank. When we returned, I found Still River crouched outside our lodge, a long, sun-bleached piece of cottonwood resting across his knees. His knife, the same one he'd used to buy me, moved with a slow, hypnotic precision. It was as if he wasn't cutting the wood, but listening to it, coaxing a shape from within it. I stopped in the shade of a nearby juniper, cradling the baby girl, Nita, who had fallen asleep against my shoulder. I didn't speak. I didn't want to break the spell. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky. The fire in our pit died down to pale ashes. The boys, Kyle and his younger brother, Tiva, played a quiet game with stones nearby. And still, Toya carved. He was lost to the world, his focus absolute. When he finally stood, his back stiff, he didn't even glance at his work. He simply left the finished piece of wood on the flat stone beside the cooking pit and disappeared back into the trees, as silent and enigmatic as ever. Only then did I dare to step forward. My breath caught in my throat. It was a cradle board, but not a small one for a newborn. This was larger, sturdier, made for a toddler who had long outgrown swaddling but still sought the comfort of being carried close. It was a work of art. It bore etched symbols I was beginning to recognize, wavy lines for water, the powerful V-shape of an eagle in flight. But at the top, where the sun would catch it, where Nita's head would rest, he had carved something else, something that made my heart stop. He had carved my name, Sarah. In the English letters, I had painstakingly taught him to draw in the dirt weeks ago, a lesson I thought he had long forgotten. My throat tightened, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. It wasn't because it was beautiful, though it was, exquisitely so. It was because it was proof of something I had been too afraid to even hope for. He saw me, not as a replacement for a lost wife, not as a vessel for a future child, not as Ima, the name the children had given me. He saw me as Sarah. The next day my hands trembled slightly as I wrapped Nita in soft hides and tied her gently into her new cradle board. She gurgled with delight, her little legs kicking, her eyes wide with wonder at her new vantage point. The boys clapped their hands, a rare and beautiful sound. Later, as I walked to the river to fetch water, Nita, secure on my back, one of the other women of the village, passed by. She was older, with sharp eyes that had always seemed to pierce right through me. She usually ignored me completely, but this time she paused. Her gaze fell on the cradle board. She looked at the carvings, at my name, and then back at my face. She gave a single curt nod. "Well made," she said simply. That was all. But it was everything. It was the first time anyone from the tribe, besides the old woman, had spoken to me without judgment, without distance. It was a crack in the wall of silence. That night, after the children were asleep, Toya sat beside me by the fire. He didn't touch me. He didn't lean close. He just looked at the fire and spoke into the flickering darkness. "Your name," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It means princess, doesn't it?" I nodded, surprised he remembered that detail from a passing conversation we'd had long ago when I was teaching him the letters. "Princess is the name for a daughter," he said, "but you are a mother." He paused, then corrected himself. "No, you are more. You are the evening. Evening? I asked, confused. It is not the end of the day, he said, a strange poetry in his simple words. It is when the stars begin to wake. He stood then, ready to leave as he always did, but this time he hesitated. He turned back, his face half in shadow. If the children ever ask about their mothers, he said quietly, tell them this. They were carved from grief, but they were raised by choice. I reached out and touched the smooth, carved wood of the cradle board resting against the lodge wall. I whispered back into the darkness. Then they were raised in love. Still, River didn't reply. But for the first time, he didn't leave. He stayed until the fire burned down to nothing but glowing red embers. He stayed until the last star woke up. We heard the horse before we saw it. A frantic, desperate sound. Hoofbeats thundering down the narrow canyon path, echoing off the stone walls like a war drum. It was a sound of pure panic, a sound of something fleeing a terror it didn't have words for. Instinct took over. The children, sensing the fear in the air, scrambled behind the lodge without a word. I stepped forward, shielding Nita against my chest, my body a frail barrier against a danger I couldn't yet see. From the trees, Toya emerged, as silent as a shadow, his longbow already in his hand, an arrow already nocked. His face was unreadable, a mask of calm, deadly focus. The rider was young, barely more than a boy, one of the tribe's hunters. His braids were frayed, his face smeared with dirt and blood. He didn't so much dismount as he did fall from the saddle, crumpling at Still River's feet. "They're coming," he gasped, his chest heaving. 3 riders, white coats. They are looking for the woman. My blood ran cold, colder than the snow I once walked barefoot across after being locked out of my own home. White coats. Soldiers, or lawmen. My past, reaching out with its long, cruel fingers. Toya knelt, checked the boy's pulse, and whispered something in Apache I couldn't understand. Then he stood, his tall frame silhouetted against the setting sun, and looked directly at me. "It is your old blood," he said quietly, his voice grim. "Someone has tracked you." "No," I whispered, the word catching in my throat. "My husband is dead. I was told he was dead. No one would come for me." But even as I said it, I knew it was a lie I had told myself. Men like him, men full of that much hate and pride, they didn't stay dead, not in spirit, not in revenge. Their ghosts lingered, poisoning everything they had ever touched. Toya moved with a swift, terrifying efficiency. He herded the children back inside the lodge, placing Nita under a bed of woven reeds, hissing instructions to Kyle and Tiva to stay silent, to make no sound, no matter what they heard. His movements were precise, urgent. This was real. Then he turned to me. His face was hard, but his eyes were not. "You can ride," he said. It wasn't a question. "Take my horse. Go east. Don't stop." "I'll hold them back." My whole body was trembling, but I shook my head. A fire I didn't know I possessed was roaring to life in my chest. I looked at the lodge where the 3 children were hiding, their lives now irrevocably tangled with mine. "I'm not leaving them," I said, my voice shaking but firm. He didn't argue. He didn't have time. Instead, he reached to his belt and pulled out a knife. Not the rusted one he'd traded for me, but his own. The handle was wrapped in leather. The blade was polished, sharp enough to shave with. He pressed it into my hand. "You fight if they reach this door," he commanded, his fingers closing around mine for a brief second. "You fight for what you have built here." I clenched the handle, the cold steel a shocking reality in my shaking palm. I don't even know how to fight," I stammered. He met my gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. "You already did," he said. "You fought when you chose to stay." The sun was a bloody smear on the western horizon when the riders came. 3 of them, just as the boy had said. They wore the dust-choked blue coats of army scouts, their faces grim and shadowed by the brims of their hats. The man in the lead, a portly man with a cruel twist to his mouth, held up a piece of paper. "That woman was bought and paid for," he shouted, his voice echoing unnaturally in the sacred quiet of the canyon. "She's property of Jedediah Stone. We have a warrant for her return." Jedediah, my husband's brother, the man who had stood there and watched me be sold for a broken knife. Still, River didn't answer. He stood tall before the lodge, his bow drawn, the arrow aimed squarely at the lead rider's chest. He was as silent and immovable as the ancient cliffs around him. Then, I did something that surprised even myself. I stepped out of the lodge, slowly. I held the baby, Nita, in the crook of one arm and the knife in my other hand. The blade felt like an extension of my own will. "You'll have to take me," I said, my voice raw but steady. It carried across the clearing, small but defiant. From inside the lodge, a small figure darted out. It was Cale. He ran to my side and took my free hand, his small fingers gripping mine with surprising strength. He looked up at the riders, his child's face set with a warrior's resolve. "We're staying," he said, his voice ringing with a courage that shamed the fear in my own bones. The wind stirred, kicking up dust devils that danced between us. Somewhere high in the cliffs, an eagle let out a piercing scream. And in that moment, the 3 riders must have realized their mistake too late. They weren't just facing a lone Apache warrior and a broken woman. They were facing a family. The first shot shattered the evening stillness like a bone snapping. The sound was a desecration in this quiet place. But I didn't flinch. Cale squeezed my hand tighter, his knuckles white. Before the echo had even faded from the canyon walls, Still River had loosed his arrow. It flew with a sound like a whisper, impossibly fast, impossibly accurate. It didn't strike the lead rider's chest. It struck his hand, the one holding the pistol. The arrow went clean through, pinning his hand to the pommel of his saddle and sending the gun skittering into the dust. The man let out a strangled scream of pain and shock, his face contorting in agony. The other 2 riders froze, their own guns half drawn. They saw something in Still River's stance, in his utter lack of fear, that gave them pause. This wasn't going to be easy. "She was paid for," the second rider shouted, his voice less certain now. He held up his badge as if it were a holy talisman that could ward off arrows. "She is property of the Stone family. It's the law." Still River didn't move a muscle. His second arrow was already nocked, aimed at the second rider's throat. "No one owns what walks free," he said, his voice low and even, yet it carried with the weight of thunder. "She came here on her own 2 feet. She will stay the same way." The wounded man, Jedediah's man, snarled through his pain. "She's barren, worthless. Her own husband cast her out. She shamed his name." That was it. The word that had defined me, the brand that had been seared into my soul. But it didn't hurt anymore. I took a step forward, Nita cooing softly in my arms, oblivious to the danger. "He never knew my name," I said, my voice ringing with a clarity that startled me. I raised the knife, not as a threat, but as proof. Proof of nerve, of will, of the calloused scars on my soul that had hardened into quiet rebellion. But these children do, and they speak it with love. The riders exchanged uncertain glances. This was not the broken, compliant woman they had been sent to retrieve. This was someone else entirely. And then, something shifted. From behind the other lodges, figures began to emerge from the deepening shadows. Men with bows, women holding farming tools like weapons, elders who said nothing, but whose eyes were like chips of obsidian, ancient and unforgiving. They fanned out, forming a silent, menacing half-circle behind Toya. He hadn't called for them. He hadn't needed to. The tribe, the same tribe that had shunned me, was now standing with me. Go. Still River said simply, the single word and undeniable command. Or stay, and see how little your laws and your names mean here. The wounded man swore, a vile string of curses. He wrenched the arrow from his hand with a guttural scream, clutching the bleeding appendage to his chest. He turned his horse, his face a mask of hatred. She'll be nothing when you're dead, savage. He spat. But even he didn't believe it. He could see it in our eyes. They rode out of the canyon with far less pride than they had arrived, vanishing into the dusk like a foul storm that had failed to take root. When they were gone, when the sound of their horses had faded completely, my knees finally gave out. The strength that had flooded my body vanished, leaving me weak and trembling. But I didn't fall. Toya was there in an instant, catching me, his hands strong and steady on my arms. He didn't carry me. He just held me upright, letting me find my own footing again. I looked at the children who were no longer hiding. Kyle and Tiva ran forward, burying their faces in my skirt. Nita, in my arms, reached up and patted my cheek with her little hand. "Did we win?" Kyle asked, his voice muffled against the fabric. I knelt, pulling him and his brother into a fierce hug. I buried my face in their hair, breathing in the scent of wood smoke and innocence. "We were never meant to fight," I whispered. "We were meant to stay." That night, a procession of shadows came to my lodge. The women of the village, the ones who had ignored me, came one by one. They didn't speak. They just left offerings by my door. A basket of freshly ground cornmeal, a warm blanket woven with bright red thread, a string of polished river stones. The old woman, the one who had spoken to me before, came last. She took my hand and pressed a necklace of iridescent shells into my palm. She leaned in close, her breath warm against my ear. "We saw you," she whispered. No one called me Barren then. In their eyes I saw a new name taking shape, a name I had never dared to dream of for myself. Mother. The ceremony wasn't planned. It began the way most sacred things do, quietly, without warning, in the deep blue hush just before dawn. I awoke to a strange light flickering against the hide walls of the lodge. I slipped out of my furs, careful not to wake the children, and peered outside. Toya was at the fire pit. He had arranged 3 large river stones in a perfect triangle around a small, newly kindled bed of embers. The flames licked at the cool morning air, casting dancing shadows. He didn't look at me as I approached, but he knew I was there. "When we bury someone," he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper, "we leave something behind. Not just the body. We leave a promise, or a wound, a reason to return to that place." I knelt beside him on the cool, packed earth. The fire felt warm on my face. "I didn't bury anyone," I said softly. "Not really. My past was a ghost, but not one with a grave." Toya picked up the first stone, its surface rough and gray. He ran his thumb along its edge. "You did," he said. "You buried the woman who waited for a child that never came. The woman who measured her worth in empty beds and silent rooms. She's gone now." He placed the stone at one point of the triangle. Then he picked up the second stone, this one smoother, darker. "The men who came yesterday," he continued, his voice steady. "They were not your past coming to haunt you. They were your grave coming to claim you, and you refused to lie down in it." He placed the second stone at another point of the triangle. Then he held up the third, its surface almost white, catching the first rays of the rising sun. "This," he said, holding it out to me, "is the part we choose. This is what rises after the burial." I took the stone from him. It was surprisingly warm and lighter than I expected. My hand didn't tremble. Without speaking, I reached forward and placed it opposite the others, completing the triangle. The fire inside the stones seemed to flicker and grow stronger, as if in recognition. Behind me, I heard the soft padding of small feet. I turned. Kale stood there, holding a single hawk feather. Tiva was beside him, clutching a strip of hide on which he'd painted a clumsy handprint in wet clay. And little Nita, holding on to the lodge wall for balance, simply laughed and reached for a lock of my hair. One by one they came forward and placed their small offerings into the fire. The feather, the handprint. Nita toddled forward and dropped a small, colorful pebble into the flames. They weren't gifts meant to burn and be destroyed. They were gifts meant to be transformed, to become part of the smoke that rose to the sky, a message to the spirits, to the ancestors. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of burning cedar, sage, and ash, and I felt a sense of fullness, of rightness that I didn't have a name for. It settled deep in my bones, a quiet, powerful peace. Still River spoke again, his voice weaving into the smoke. "We do not make families with blood alone," he said. "We tend to them, like this fire. Some are born from the embers within us. Some are kindled by those who come to us from the cold." I opened my eyes and looked at him, really looked at him for the first time, not as a savior or a protector or a silent, mysterious warrior, but as a man who saw the world the way I had always wished it could be, a man who understood that value wasn't determined by what you could produce, but by what you could protect. "I don't want a wedding," I said, the words surprising me as they came out. "I don't want a ceremony with vows. I want this. I want roots," I finished. He nodded, a slow, deep acknowledgement. "Then stay." There was no kiss. No grand declaration. No promises for a future that hadn't happened yet. There was just the stillness of the canyon at dawn, the warmth of the fire, the presence of the children, and the slow, sacred feeling of something real beginning, not from the ashes of what was lost, but from the rich, fertile earth itself. Later that night, when the children were curled up in their furs, Tiva asked what the fire ceremony had meant. I smiled, pulling a blanket over his shoulders. "It means we won't have to run anymore," I said. "It means we are home." Word travels in two ways in the territory. It travels fast as lightning along the telegraph wires and trade routes of the white man. And it travels slow as a creeping vine in the canyons and hidden places, passed from tribe to tribe, from hunter to hunter, in whispers and stories. Weeks passed with no sign of more riders, no echoes of the violent life I had escaped. A fragile peace settled over the village. But something had shifted, not just around me, but within the heart of the community. They had seen me stand my ground. They had seen me choose the children over my own safety. They had seen me as more than just a white woman, an outcast. The village no longer turned away when I walked to the river. The women would offer small, shy smiles. The children who weren't mine, the other orphans of the raid, began to bring me small offerings, a braid of sweetgrass, a handful of shiny beads, a pine cone they insisted was shaped like a heart. I was becoming a landmark in their small, wounded world. One evening, the sharp-eyed old woman, the one who had spoken of the well-made cradleboard, came to my fire. She didn't speak, but placed a heavy clay jar in my hands. It was filled with precious seeds, corn, squash, and beans, the three sisters. "You will plant with us this spring," she said, her voice firm. It was not a question or an invitation. It was a statement of fact, a promotion. "What grows in your hands will not die." I didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. For my entire adult life, I had lived with the label of barren ground, waiting for a permission to bloom that never came. Now I was being asked to help seed the future of an entire people. Toya, Still River, began to build a new structure. Not for us to live in, but for me. It was a small, circular lodge, built near our own. "Why?" I had asked him, confused. "You teach the other women now," he said simply. "How to stitch wounds, how to tell stories to the children, how to find the right herbs." It was true. Slowly, cautiously, the other women, especially the younger widows, had started coming to me, seeking the small bits of knowledge I possessed from my old life. "This lodge is not for sleeping," he explained, lashing a pole into place. "It is for your name." He meant my purpose. I understood. When it was finished, he painted symbols on a smooth piece of bark and hung it over the door. There was a symbol for Kyle and Tiva and Nita. There was one for him, a flowing river, and one for me, a crescent moon representing the evening. But above them all, he painted a new symbol, one I had never seen before. It looked like a spiral turning back in on itself. "What is that one?" I asked. "It has no name in our tongue," he said. "Not for this meaning. It means given back. You were taken from yourself. Now you have returned." That night, the village sang. But they didn't sing for me. They sang with me. We sat around a great central fire, the entire tribe, and the elders began a song. It was the same mournful lullaby that Toya had hummed for his sister. But tonight, it was different. Other voices joined in, my own included, and the song transformed from a dirge of sorrow into an anthem of survival and remembrance. The children fell asleep beside me, their heads in my lap. The baby, Nita, was nestled deep in my arms, as if she had always been there. And then one of the elder men, a chief whose face was a testament to 100 hard winters, rose and came to me. He placed a heavy carved pendant around my neck. "You are the hearth now," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "The fire that warms the children who were left in the cold." I didn't flinch. I didn't deflect the honor. I simply bowed my head in gratitude. I finally understood. Being called mother was not about blood or birth. It was about presence, about showing up, about staying. And being called Barren had never been a true reflection of my body. It had been a reflection of what a cruel and blind world refused to see. Now, this village, this family, they saw. And they sang. And I, Sarah, who had once been sold for my silence, was somehow the loudest drum in the circle. The sun rose slow and golden that last morning, catching the smoke tendrils from a dozen warming fires, softening every sharp edge of the canyon into something that felt like a memory. I stood at the edge of the new corn plots, my hands muddy, my breath a pale mist in the early chill. Behind me, the village stirred to life with the familiar sounds of children laughing and a single drum echoing lightly from the far lodge. Toya was sitting cross-legged nearby, his back straight, carving something into a long, smooth strip of bark. "Is that a story for the boys?" I asked, brushing the rich, dark dirt from my palms. He didn't look up from his work, his knife moving in deft, sure strokes. "It's for you." When he was finished, he held it up. On it, he had etched 3 circles. They weren't perfect geometric circles. They were organic, hand-drawn, and they interlocked, weaving into one another to form a single, unified design. "The elders say your spirit is born again when it is named by those who love you," he said. "This is how the children name you. All 3 of them. Not just Ima, but as a part of them." I blinked, tracing the interlocking lines with my eyes. "What do the circles mean?" "One for each," he said. "A family, not born from you, but now a part of you." That night, as the fire crackled and cast our shadows long against the lodge wall, the children came to me with their own offering. They had been conspiring all day, their whispers and giggles a constant, happy undercurrent. With a great flourish, Kale and Tiva unveiled their work. They had each painted a bright red handprint on the outer wall of my teaching lodge. "So, no one ever forgets who lives here?" Kale announced proudly. Tiva, ever the more poetic one, added, "It's for the woman who fed us when no one would, the woman who named us when we had no names, the woman who stayed." My heart felt so full I thought it might burst, and then, the biggest surprise of all, Nita, who was now walking with a confident, wobbly gait, and speaking her first few words in the Apache tongue, toddled forward. She held something out to me in her chubby little hand. It was a round river stone, but it had been painted with 4 distinct bands of color. The lines were smudged and uneven, clearly the work of tiny, clumsy fingers. The little girl looked up at me, her dark eyes shining with an incredible, innocent wisdom, and said a phrase in her mixed-up tongue. I looked to Toya for a translation, a smile already on my face. He smiled back, a rare and beautiful sight. She says, "This is for the next baby." I froze, not because I was pregnant, I wasn't. My body had not changed, but my world had. I froze, because this tiny child, who had lost everything, had somehow already understood a truth that most grown men never do. That a home isn't a place that is full. It's a place with room for more. That motherhood wasn't a biological condition, it was a state of being. It was an open door, a choice you make, again and again, every single day. I looked at Toya, my eyes swimming with tears I hadn't realized I was crying. He simply nodded, his gaze full of a deep and abiding love. I took the painted stone from Nita and held it in my palm. It felt like the whole world. "Then we'll be ready," I said softly, my voice thick with emotion, "for whoever finds their way to our fire next." As the firelight danced against the walls of our home, I placed the small painted stone on the mantel above the hearth. Not as a prayer for a child of my own blood, not as a promise of what might be, but as a welcome. I, who had been sold as Barren, had become a beginning, not just for 3 lost children, but for the many more who might need a place to be found. If you were moved by Sarah's story of finding family in the most unexpected of places, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more true-hearted tales from the echoes of the past. And I have to ask you, it's a question that's been on my mind this whole time. If you were in that village and you saw this outcast woman and these 3 orphan children, would you have shared your fire with them? Let me know your honest answer in the comments below.